24 hours at -88 degrees Celsius. How the Mafia boss survived alone in Yakutia's frozen desert. The wind cut through the darkness like a blade forged from ice itself. Dmitry Volkov stood at the edge of the world, where the sky bled into white and the horizon vanished beneath an endless sheet of frozen silence. His breath crystallized the moment it left his lips, falling to the ground like shattered glass. Behind him, the wreckage of the helicopter smoldered against the snow, black smoke curling upward into a sky so pale it seemed to have surrendered all color to the cold. -88 degrees. The temperature display on his wrist had stopped working 20 minutes ago, frozen solid like everything else in this forsaken land. But Dmitry knew the number. He had memorized it before the crash, watching it drop with each passing minute as the pilot fought against the storm that had swallowed them whole. -88. Cold enough to freeze exposed skin in 30 seconds. Cold enough to turn a man's lungs into ice if he breathed too deeply. Cold enough to kill anyone foolish enough to believe they could survive alone in Yakutia's frozen heart. He was that fool now. The Republic of Sakha stretched around him in every direction, a vast emptiness that made the deserts of the world seem crowded by comparison. 3 million square kilometers of permafrost, taiga, and tundra, the coldest inhabited region on Earth. And Dmitry Volkov, the man who had built an empire from nothing, who had faced down rivals and enemies across 3 continents, who had never shown fear to anyone who lived to tell about it, was utterly, completely alone. His fingers were already going numb inside his gloves. The cold had found the seams, the tiny imperfections in the thermal lining, and it was working its way inward with patient, methodical cruelty. He flexed his hands, forcing blood into the extremities, buying himself a few more minutes of dexterity. A few more minutes to think. The pilot was dead. Viktor Sergeyevich, who had flown Dmitry through storms and firefights and across borders that existed on no official maps, had died on impact when the rotor failed and sent them spiraling down through the whiteout. Dmitry had crawled from the wreckage with nothing but the clothes on his back, a single emergency flare, and the knowledge that rescue would not come. Not here. Not in time. He had been betrayed. The realization settled into his chest like a second kind of cold, one that had nothing to do with temperature. Someone had sabotaged the helicopter, someone who knew his route, his schedule, his vulnerabilities, someone close enough to touch the machine, to compromise its systems, to send him plummeting into this frozen wasteland where no one would ever find his body. Dmitry turned his back to the wind and began to walk. There was no destination, no shelter visible on the endless white plain, no road, no village, no sign that human beings had ever set foot in this particular corner of the world. But standing still meant death. Movement meant survival, at least for a few more hours. And Dmitry Volkov had not clawed his way from the poverty of his childhood to the heights of power by accepting death when it came knocking. His boots crunched against the frozen surface with each step, the sound swallowed almost instantly by the vastness around him. The sun hung low on the horizon, a pale disk that provided light without warmth, and he knew it would soon disappear entirely. Winter in Yakutia meant 20 hours of darkness, 20 hours when the temperature would drop even further, when the cold would tighten its grip until even the stars seemed to shiver in the black sky above. He had perhaps 6 hours before nightfall, 6 hours to find shelter or create it, 6 hours to defy everything the universe was throwing at him. His mind drifted as he walked, carried backward by the cold and the silence to places he had not visited in years. To the cramped apartment in Brooklyn where he had grown up, 3 brothers sharing one bedroom while their mother worked double shifts just to keep the heat on. To the frozen nights when the radiator failed and they huddled together beneath every blanket they owned, their breath visible in the dim light from the street below. He had known cold then, real cold, the kind that came from poverty and desperation, and the certainty that no one in the world cared whether they lived or died. But that cold had made him strong. It had forged him into something harder than the streets that tried to break him, sharper than the men who underestimated him, more ruthless than the systems designed to keep people like him in their place. He had risen from nothing to command respect across an empire that spanned legitimate businesses and shadow operations alike. He had earned enemies and allies in equal measure. He had learned that power was not given but taken, and that survival was the first and most important victory any man could claim. Now survival was the only thing that mattered. The landscape began to change as he walked, subtle shifts that might have been invisible to anyone who had not spent years reading terrain, and threat in equal measure. The flat plain gave way to gentle undulations, snow-covered ridges that rose and fell like frozen waves. In the distance, he could make out a darker smudge against the white, something that might have been rock or vegetation or simply a trick of the light. He adjusted his course and kept moving. The cold was inside him now, spreading from his extremities toward his core with the inevitability of tide. His jaw ached from clenching against the shivering that wanted to consume him, and his legs felt heavy, as if the frozen air itself was pressing down on them with physical weight. He knew the signs. He had read the studies, attended the briefings, learned what happened to the human body when it was exposed to temperatures. No human was meant to endure. First came the shivering, the body's desperate attempt to generate heat through muscle movement. Then the extremities began to shut down, blood retreating to protect the vital organs at the center. Confusion followed, a fog that crept over the mind and made every decision harder than the last. And finally, paradoxically, warmth, a false sense of comfort that preceded the end, the brain's final mercy before consciousness slipped away entirely. He was still in the first stage, still thinking clearly, still capable of fighting. The dark smudge resolved itself into a cluster of rocks as he drew closer, ancient boulders that had been pushed up through the permafrost by forces older than human memory. They offered no warmth, but they offered something almost as valuable: windbreak. A place where the cutting gusts could not reach him directly, where he might be able to create some semblance of shelter from the elements that were trying to kill him. Dmitri reached the rocks and pressed himself against the largest one, feeling its frozen surface even through his insulated coat. His hands were clumsy now, the fine motor control slipping away as his body prioritized survival over precision. But he forced them to work, digging into the snow at the base of the boulder, carving out a hollow that might shield him from the worst of the cold. It took an hour to create something that resembled a shelter, a depression in the snow, walled on three sides by compacted ice and roofed by the overhang of the boulder itself. It was barely large enough to contain him, and it would not keep him warm, but it would slow the wind and trap whatever body heat he could generate. It might be enough to survive the night, if he was lucky. Dmitri crawled into the hollow and pulled his knees to his chest, wrapping his arms around himself in a futile attempt to conserve warmth. The shivering had become violent now, his entire body shaking with the effort of staying alive. He closed his eyes and focused on his breathing, slow and measured, drawing the frozen air into his lungs in careful sips rather than desperate gasps. In the darkness behind his eyes, he saw her face. Elena. She had come into his life like a storm, unexpected and impossible to ignore. A doctor who had stumbled into his world by accident, treating one of his men after a confrontation that had gone wrong. She had looked at Dmitri with eyes that held no fear, no judgment, no recognition of the power he wielded. She had seen only a man standing in her emergency room, bleeding and dangerous and utterly human. That had been 3 years ago. 3 years of learning to trust someone who demanded nothing from him except honesty. 3 years of discovering that the walls he had built around his heart were not as impenetrable as he had believed. 3 years of slowly, carefully, allowing himself to feel something other than ambition and anger and the cold calculation that had carried him to the top. She was waiting for him now. In the townhouse they shared on the Upper East Side, surrounded by the legitimate businesses he had been building, the foundation that would eventually allow him to step away from the shadows entirely. She was waiting, and she did not know that he was dying in a frozen wasteland thousands of miles away. The thought of her face, the way her eyes crinkled when she smiled, the sound of her laugh echoing through their kitchen on lazy Sunday mornings, cut through the cold like nothing else could. It reminded him why he had to survive, why failure was not an option. He had made her a promise. He had looked into her eyes on their wedding day, just 6 months ago, and sworn that he would always come back to her. That no matter where his work took him, no matter what dangers he faced, he would find his way home. Dmitry Volkov did not break his promises. The night descended like a curtain falling across a stage, sudden and absolute. One moment the pale sun was hovering above the horizon, and the next it was gone, swallowed by the endless white that stretched in every direction. The temperature plummeted further, dropping past anything the human body was designed to endure, and the stars emerged overhead with a clarity that would have been beautiful if it had not been so deadly. He drifted in and out of consciousness as the hours crawled past, his mind wandering through memories and dreams and the strange territories that existed between them. He saw his mother's face, worn and weary from years of sacrifice. He saw his brothers scattered now across the country, each of them carrying scars from the life they had survived together. He saw the men who had tried to destroy him over the years, their faces blurring together into a single expression of hatred and envy and fear. And he saw Eleanor, always Eleanor, her presence like a beacon in the darkness. The cold was winning. He could feel it claiming territory inside him, numbing his thoughts as thoroughly as it had numbed his fingers and toes. The shivering had stopped at some point, which meant his body had given up trying to generate heat. The false warmth was beginning to creep in, that deadly comfort that preceded the end. He forced his eyes open and stared up at the stars. They were impossibly bright, pinpricks of light scattered across a black canvas that seemed to stretch into infinity. No city glow to dim them, no clouds to obscure them, just the raw and ancient light of suns that had been burning for billions of years. In another context, another moment, it might have been the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Now it was simply a reminder of how small he was, how fragile, how easily the universe could snuff out even the strongest flame. But Dmitry Volkov had not become who he was by accepting his smallness. He had not built his empire by bowing to forces greater than himself. He had fought and clawed and refused to surrender when everyone around him said the battle was lost. He had made himself into something more than the circumstances of his birth, and he would not let this frozen wasteland take that from him. He began to move. It was agonizing, his body protesting every motion with pain that cut deeper than the cold itself. His muscles had stiffened, his joints felt welded in place, and every inch of progress required an act of will that bordered on the impossible. But he moved. He crawled from his hollow shelter and forced himself to stand, his legs shaking beneath him like a newborn animal taking its first steps. The stars watched him passively as he began to walk again. He had no destination now, no plan beyond the simple imperative to keep moving. The cold would kill him if he stopped, and so he would not stop. He would walk until his legs gave out, and then he would crawl. He would keep fighting until there was nothing left to fight with, and even then he would find some way to continue. Because Elena was waiting. Because he had made a promise. Because Dmitry Volkov did not know how to surrender. The hours blurred together in a haze of pain and determination. He fell more times than he could count, his body pitching forward into the snow, only to rise again through sheer force of will. The landscape around him remained unchanged, an endless white expanse that offered no landmarks, no hope, no indication that he was moving toward anything at all. But he kept walking. The first hint of dawn came as a pale glow on the eastern horizon, a suggestion of light that grew stronger with each passing minute. Dmitry watched it through eyes that were nearly frozen shut, his lashes crusted with ice, his vision blurred by exhaustion and cold. It was beautiful, that light, beautiful and terrifying in equal measure, because it meant he had survived the night, but also that the day would bring new challenges, new tests of his will to live. And then he saw it. A shape in the distance, dark against the growing light, not rocks this time, but something angular and deliberate, something that could only have been built by human hands. Hope surged through him with almost physical force, warm and desperate and utterly irrational. He was still hours from whatever that shape represented, still fighting against a cold that had been trying to kill him all night. But it was there. Something was there. He found reserves of strength he had not known he possessed and pushed forward. The shape resolved itself slowly as he approached, details emerging from the white like a photograph developing in solution. Walls, a roof, a door hanging slightly ajar, revealing darkness within. It was a cabin, small and weathered and clearly abandoned, but it was shelter, real shelter. A place where he might finally stop running from the cold. Dmitri reached the door and pushed it open with hands that could barely feel the wood beneath their touch. The interior was dark and frozen, but it was out of the wind, out of the endless assault that had been wearing him down for nearly 20 hours. He stumbled inside and collapsed against the far wall, his body finally giving out now that it had found something resembling safety. For a long moment, he simply lay there, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his heart pounding against ribs that felt like they might shatter from the cold. The cabin was not warm. Nothing in this place could be warm. But it was protection, and protection was enough. When he had gathered enough strength to move again, he began to explore his surroundings. The cabin was a single room, perhaps 4 meters square, with a floor of packed earth and walls of weathered timber. In one corner, he found a small stove, rusted but intact, with a pile of dried wood stacked beside it. In another corner, a bed frame with a mattress so frozen it felt like stone, and on a shelf near the door, a collection of supplies that someone had left behind. Canned food, a box of matches, a kerosene lantern with fuel still in its reservoir. Someone had lived here once. Someone had carved out an existence in this impossible place, surviving against odds that would have broken most people. Dmitri did not know their story, did not know whether they had left voluntarily or been claimed by the cold like so many others. But he was grateful for whatever they had left behind. His hands were too numb to work the matches on the first try, or the second. But on the third he managed to strike a flame, a tiny point of light that seemed almost miraculous in the frozen darkness. He held it to the kindling in the stove with trembling fingers, watching as the fire caught and spread, feeling the first tentative waves of warmth begin to push back against the cold. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. The stories you will find here are not ordinary tales. They are journeys into the deepest parts of the human heart, moments of courage and survival that will stay with you long after the video ends. If you want to experience more stories like this one, stories that remind you what it means to truly fight for survival, then subscribe now. You do not want to miss what comes next. The fire grew stronger as he fed it, flames dancing in the rusted belly of the stove, casting flickering shadows across the cabin walls. Dmitri pulled himself closer, his body aching for the warmth it had been denied for so long. The heat hurt at first, his frozen tissues screaming in protest as blood began to flow again, but it was the kind of pain that meant survival, the kind of pain that meant he was still alive. He thought of Elena again as he watched the flames, thought of the phone call he would make when he finally reached civilization, the sound of her voice breaking when she heard that he was safe, thought of the promises he had made and the promises he intended to keep. But first, he had to understand what had happened. Someone had tried to kill him. Someone with access to his innermost circle, someone who knew his movements and his vulnerabilities well enough to orchestrate a crash in the most remote location imaginable. This had not been a random accident or a stroke of bad fortune. This had been an assassination attempt, carefully planned and nearly successful. The list of suspects was longer than Dmitri would have liked to admit. He had made enemies throughout his rise, men who resented his power, competitors who wanted what he had built, former allies who felt betrayed by decisions he had been forced to make. Any one of them might have seen an opportunity and taken it. But there was something else, something that nagged at the edges of his consciousness as the warmth slowly seeped back into his body. The timing was too perfect, the location too remote. Whoever had done this had not just wanted him dead, they had wanted him erased, disappeared. A mystery that would never be solved, that spoke to something more than business rivalry or personal vendetta. That spoke to someone who feared what Dmitri knew or what he might discover. He turned his mind to the past weeks, searching for anything that might explain the attack. There had been the negotiations in Moscow, the delicate dance of power and money that was reshaping the global market for certain commodities. There had been the investigation he had quietly launched into irregularities in his own organization, discrepancies that suggested someone was skimming profits or sharing information with competitors. And there had been the meeting just 3 days ago with an old contact who had hinted at something bigger, something that reached into circles Dmitri had never touched. The contact had died the next day. A car accident, the report said. But Dmitri had stopped believing in accidents a long time ago. He was too tired to piece together the full picture now. His mind was foggy with exhaustion and the lingering effects of cold that had nearly claimed his life. But he filed away the questions for later, adding them to the mental ledger he kept of debts to be paid and answers to be found. For now, survival remained the priority. The cabin offered more than just shelter, he discovered, as he explored it with renewed energy. Behind the stove, tucked into a corner, he found a small radio, the kind used by trappers and hunters in remote areas to stay in contact with the outside world. Its batteries were dead, but among the supplies on the shelf, he found replacements, still sealed in their packaging. His fingers had recovered enough dexterity to work the small screws that held the battery compartment closed. He installed the fresh cells and turned the radio on, his heart pounding as static filled the small cabin. He adjusted the dial, searching through frequencies, listening for any sign of human presence in this frozen wilderness. For long minutes, there was nothing but the hiss of empty airwaves. Then, faint but unmistakable, a voice emerged from the static. It was speaking Russian, a weather report from some distant station, describing conditions that Dmitri already knew intimately. But it was human contact. It was proof that the world beyond this cabin still existed, still functioned, still offered the possibility of rescue. He noted the frequency and began to compose a message in his head. He would need to be careful about what he said and who he said it to. If someone had tried to kill him once, they might be monitoring the airways, waiting to confirm their success or track him down to finish the job. But he could not stay here forever. The supplies in the cabin would last perhaps a week, and he had no way of knowing when the next storm might come. The warmth from the stove had fully permeated the small space now, raising the temperature to something that felt almost comfortable compared to the deadly cold outside. Dmitri found himself fighting exhaustion, his body demanding rest after the ordeal it had endured. He made his way to the frozen mattress and lay down, pulling his coat tight around him, letting his eyes close for the first time in what felt like forever. Sleep took him instantly, a black and dreamless void that offered respite from the pain and the cold and the burning questions that would demand answers when he woke. When he opened his eyes again, hours had passed. The fire in the stove had burned low, reduced to glowing embers that cast a dim red light across the cabin. Outside, the small window. He could see that the sun had risen higher, casting long shadows across the snow-covered landscape. He rose stiffly and fed more wood into the stove, coaxing the flames back to life. His body ached with 1,000 small complaints, muscles and joints protesting the abuse they had suffered. But he was alive. Against all odds, against all logic, he had survived a night that should have killed him. Now, it was time to start thinking about what came next. The radio sat where he had left it, a lifeline to the world beyond this frozen cabin. He picked it up and began to search through frequencies again, this time with more purpose. He was looking for something specific, a channel that his organization used for secure communications, one that might allow him to reach someone he trusted without alerting whoever had sent him to this place. It took nearly an hour of patient searching before he found it. The frequency was faint, barely audible above the background static, but he recognized the coded signals that indicated it was active. He picked up the microphone and began to speak, using phrases that would identify him to anyone listening on the other end. The response came after an agonizing delay, a familiar voice crackling through the speaker. "Dmitri, is that you? We thought the helicopter went down. The search teams found nothing but wreckage. We thought you were dead. It was Marcus, his second in command, a man he had trusted for nearly a decade. The relief in his voice was palpable, even through the distortion of the radio signal. "I am alive," Dmitri said, his own voice rough from cold and disuse. "The crash was sabotage. Someone wanted me dead, and they nearly succeeded. I need extraction, Marcus. I'm in a cabin somewhere in the Yakutian interior. I do not know the exact coordinates, but I can give you landmarks." He described what he had seen during his long walk through the frozen landscape, the rock formations, and the subtle variations in terrain that might help a skilled pilot locate him. Marcus listened without interruption, asking clarifying questions only when necessary. "I will have a team in the air within the hour," Marcus said when Dmitri finished. "But there is something you should know. Things have changed since you disappeared. There are people who have used your absence to make moves against the organization, and there are rumors, Dmitri. Rumors that you did not crash by accident. Rumors that someone very close to you was responsible." The words landed like physical blows, confirming the suspicions that had been forming in Dmitri's mind since he crawled from the wreckage. Someone close, someone he trusted. The betrayal was not just business, it was personal. "Who?" he asked, the single word carrying the weight of everything he had built and everything he stood to lose. "I do not want to say over an open channel," Marcus replied, "but when I reach you, we will talk, face to face. There are things you need to know, things that will change everything." The connection crackled and faded, leaving Dmitri alone with his thoughts and the dancing flames of the stove. He set the radio down and stared at the small fire, watching the light flicker across the cabin walls. Someone close to him, someone he trusted. The list was shorter than it had been before, but it was still too long. Marcus himself was on it, though Dmitri's instincts said the man was loyal. There were others, people who had been with him for years, who had benefited from his rise and would suffer from his fall. Any of them might have decided that removing Dmitri was worth the risk. But there was one name that kept surfacing in his thoughts, one face that he did not want to consider but could not ignore. Someone who had been present at every meeting, who knew every secret, who had access to everything Dmitri owned and controlled. His brother. Viktor Volkov had always resented living in Dmitri's shadow. The younger brother, the one who had stayed behind while Dmitri built something from nothing, the one who had been handed opportunities rather than earning them. Their relationship had been strained for years, marked by arguments and accusations and the slow erosion of the bond they had shared as children. But to try to kill him, to send him to die in a frozen wasteland thousands of miles from home. Dmitri did not want to believe it, but he had learned long ago that wanting something did not make it true. The hours stretched on as he waited for rescue. He ate sparingly from the supplies in the cabin, conserved the wood for the stove, monitored the radio for any sign that help was on the way. The cold outside remained brutal, a reminder that his survival was still provisional, still dependent on circumstances beyond his control. When the sound of helicopter blades finally reached his ears, cutting through the silence like a promise of salvation, Dmitri felt something loosen in his chest. He stepped out of the cabin and watched the aircraft descend, its rotors throwing up clouds of snow as it touched down on the frozen plain. Marcus was the first to emerge, his face lined with worry and relief in equal measure. He crossed the distance between them and embraced Dmitri with the fervor of a man who had truly believed he would never see his friend again. "You are a stubborn man, Dmitri Volkov," Marcus said, pulling back to look at him with something like wonder. "Any other person would have died out here. You survived through sheer force of will." "I had something to live for," Dmitri replied, his thoughts turning to Elena, to the home waiting for him, to the future he refused to surrender. They boarded the helicopter and lifted off, leaving the cabin behind as a small dark shape against the endless white. Dmitri watched it disappear through the window, grateful for the shelter it had provided, grateful for the unknown person who had built it and left behind the supplies that had saved his life. The flight back to civilization was long, but Marcus used the time to brief Dmitri on everything that had happened since the crash. The power plays, the shifting alliances, The whispered rumors that suggested someone at the highest levels of the organization had orchestrated the assassination attempt. Names were mentioned, theories proposed, evidence weighed. And then Marcus said the name that Dmitri had been dreading. Victor has been making moves, Dmitri, consolidating power, meeting with people he should not be meeting with, acting like a man who expects to inherit an empire. I do not have proof, but everything points to him. He is the one who knew your route. He is the one who had access to the helicopter. He is the one who benefits most from your death. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Dmitri closed his eyes and let the truth settle into him. His brother, his own blood, the boy he had protected on the streets of Brooklyn, the young man he had brought into the organization against his better judgment, the family he had tried to lift up even as they resented his success. If you want a sentence that people simply cannot ignore, the narrator continued, write this in the comments right now. Family can become the deepest wound. Let me know in the comments if you have ever felt betrayed by someone you loved with all your heart. Victor had tried to kill him, had sent him to die in the coldest place on Earth, had gambled everything on the assumption that Dmitri Volkov would not survive. He had gambled wrong. The helicopter carried them away from the frozen wilderness, back toward a world of power and consequence and the reckoning that awaited. Dmitri watched the landscape pass beneath them, his mind already turning to what would come next. There would be confrontation. There would be justice. There would be a settling of accounts that would reshape everything he had built. But first, there was something more important. Elena. The helicopter landed on a private airstrip outside Moscow, where a plane waited to carry Dmitri back to New York. He made the calls he needed to make, set the wheels in motion for what would come next, but his primary focus was on getting home, getting back to her. The flight across the Atlantic felt longer than any he had ever taken, each minute stretching into an eternity as he counted down the distance between them. He had not spoken to Elena directly, yet had not wanted to frighten her with a call before he could see her face to face. But Marcus had passed word through trusted channels, letting her know that Dmitri was alive, that he was coming home, that everything would be explained when he arrived. The plane touched down in the early morning hours, New York spread out beneath them like a constellation of lights. A car waited on the tarmac, and Dmitri climbed inside without a word to the driver, his entire being focused on the destination ahead. The townhouse on the Upper East Side looked exactly as he had left it, warm light glowing in the windows despite the hour. He stepped out of the car and walked to the door, his heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with the cold he had survived or the enemies he would face. The door opened before he could reach for the handle. Elena stood there, her face pale, her eyes red from tears that she had clearly been fighting since word of his survival reached her. For a moment, neither of them moved, the distance between them charged with everything they had almost lost. Then she was in his arms, and he was holding her with a desperation that surprised even him. She was warm and real and alive, and he was home, truly home, in a way that went far beyond geography. "I thought I lost you," she whispered against his chest. "When they said the helicopter went down, when they could not find you, I thought I lost you, Dmitri. I promised I would always come back." "To you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I will never break that promise, never." They stood there for a long time, holding each other in the doorway, letting the reality of reunion wash over them. The street was quiet around them, the city still sleeping, unaware of the miracle that had occurred in its midst. Finally, Eleanor pulled back and looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for the truth of what he had endured. "What happened?" she asked. "Marcus said it was sabotage. Someone tried to kill you." Dmitri nodded, the weight of the betrayal settling back onto his shoulders now that the immediate relief of homecoming had passed. "Someone I trusted. Someone very close." He did not say the name. Not yet. Not here, in this moment that belonged to them and them alone. There would be time for confrontation, for justice, for all the hard decisions that awaited him. But right now, He wanted only to be here, with her, in the warmth of the life they were building together. "Come." "Inside," Eleanor said, taking his hand and leading him through the door. "You need rest, you need to heal. Whatever comes next, it can wait until you are strong again." She was right, as she so often was. The trials ahead would require all of his strength, all of his cunning, all of the ruthlessness that had carried him to the heights of power. But that could wait. For now, he let himself be led, let himself be cared for, let himself remember why survival had mattered so much in those dark hours on the frozen plain. The days that followed were a strange interlude, a pause in the storm before the inevitable confrontation. Dmitri allowed himself to recover, his body healing from the ordeal, while his mind turned over the evidence and the options. Elena stayed close, her presence a constant reminder of everything he was fighting for. And slowly, the pieces of the puzzle began to come together. Victor had indeed been making moves in Dmitri's absence, meeting with rivals, making promises, positioning himself to take control of the organization if his brother failed to return. The evidence was circumstantial but overwhelming, a pattern of behavior that pointed to guilt even without direct proof. But Dmitri wanted more than evidence. He wanted to understand why. The confrontation came on a cold afternoon in the study of the townhouse where Dmitri had built his legitimate empire. Victor arrived at the appointed time, his face a careful mask of concern and relief. "Brother," Victor said, crossing the room to embrace Dmitri with what seemed like genuine emotion, "thank God you are alive. When we heard about the crash, I thought the worst. I thought I had lost you." Dmitri allowed the embrace, studying his brother's face for any crack in the facade. Victor was a skilled dissembler, always had been, his charm and charisma the weapons he wielded in place of the harder qualities that had made Dmitri who he was. "The crash was not an accident," Dmitri said when they separated, his voice calm and measured. "The helicopter was sabotaged. Someone tried to kill me, Victor." He watched his brother's reaction carefully. The flicker of surprise, quickly suppressed. The tightening around the eyes that might have been fear, or might have been guilt. The slight shift in posture that suggested readiness for confrontation rather than shock at revelation. "That is terrible," Victor said, his voice steady, but his eyes betraying uncertainty. "Do you know who was responsible?" "I will help you find them, brother. Whoever did this will pay." "I already know who was responsible," Dmitri replied, and he saw the moment the truth registered in Victor's eyes. The brief flash of pure terror before the mask slammed back into place. "Dmitri, whatever you think you know, I know everything, Victor. The meetings you had while I was building this organization, the promises you made to people who wanted me out of the way, the access you had to the helicopter, the knowledge of my route, the opportunity to sabotage a machine you knew I would trust, because you were the one who arranged for it to be ready." Victor's face had gone pale, the charm stripped away to reveal something harder and more desperate beneath. "It is not what you think. I had no choice. There were pressures, debts, people who threatened everything I cared about. I did not want to hurt you, brother. I wanted to save myself. By killing me, by removing an obstacle, you were never supposed to know it was me. You were supposed to disappear, and I was supposed to take over, and everything would have continued as it always had. You were not supposed to survive." The confession hung in the air between them, stark and undeniable. Dmitri felt something shift inside him, the last fragment of hope that his brother might be innocent shattering into pieces that could never be reassembled. "You betrayed me," he said simply. "You betrayed our family, our blood, everything we survived together as children. For what? Power? Money? The chance to step out of my shadow? I was never in your shadow, Dmitri. I was under your heel. Everything I had, everything I achieved, existed only because you allowed it. I wanted something of my own. I wanted to be more than the younger brother of the great Dmitri Volkov." There was genuine pain in Victor's voice, genuine grievance that had festered for years before finally erupting into violence. Dmitri recognized it, understood it, even as he could not forgive it. the resentment of someone who felt diminished, overlooked, reduced to a supporting character in someone else's story. But understanding did not change the facts, did not undo the sabotage, the crash, the 24 hours of frozen torment that Dmitri had survived through nothing but will and luck. "What happens now?" Victor asked, and for the first time there was fear in his voice. Real fear, not the calculated performance he had offered when he first arrived. "Will you kill me, brother? Is that the price of my betrayal?" Dmitri was silent for a long moment, weighing options and consequences. There had been a time, not so long ago, when the answer would have been simple, when the punishment for betrayal was swift and final, when enemies and traitors alike learned through example what happened to those who crossed Dmitri Volkov. But that was the old life. The shadow life. The path he had been trying to leave behind, one careful step at a time. "No," he said finally. "I am not going to kill you, Victor. That is not who I want to be anymore." Relief flickered across Victor's face, quickly followed by suspicion. "Then what?" "You are going to leave. You are going to take what you can carry and disappear. You will not come back to New York, will not contact anyone in the organization, will not so much as think about the empire you tried to steal. You're going to build a new life somewhere far from here, a life that has nothing to do with me or what I have built. And if I refuse," Dmitri's eyes hardened, "then we will have a different conversation, one you will not survive." The threat was real, and Victor knew it. For all his scheming and ambition, he was not a man of violence, had never developed the stomach for the harder aspects of the life their family had chosen. He had gambled on removing Dmitri from a distance, through sabotage and cold, because he could not face his brother directly. Now that gamble had failed, and the only choice left was acceptance or annihilation. "I will go," Victor said quietly. "I will leave and I will not come back. But know this, brother. I did not do this because I hated you. I did this because I could not live in your shadow any longer. Whatever that means, whatever it costs, at least understand that much." Dmitri nodded slowly, accepting the explanation without embracing it. "Goodbye, Victor. Do not make me come looking for you." His brother turned and walked out of the study, out of the townhouse, out of Dmitri's life. The door closed behind him with a sound of finality, marking the end of a relationship that had been crumbling for years before finally collapsing entirely. Dmitri stood alone in the silence that followed, processing everything that had happened. The betrayal, the confrontation, the mercy he had offered despite every instinct screaming for vengeance. He had chosen a different path, a harder path, one that required strength of a different kind than the violence that had defined his earlier years. Elena found him there an hour later, still standing by the window, watching the street below as if expecting his brother to return. "It is done?" she asked, moving to stand beside him. "It is done. He is gone. He will not come back." She took his hand, intertwining her fingers with his. "How do you feel?" It was a question that deserved a careful answer, one that reflected the complexity of what he had experienced. The survival, the betrayal, the confrontation, the choice to show mercy when revenge would have been so much easier. "I feel," Dmitri said slowly, "like I am finally becoming the man I want to be, the man you deserve." Elena smiled and leaned against his shoulder. "You have always been that man, Dmitri. You just needed time to see it for yourself." They stood together in the fading afternoon light, watching the city continue its endless rhythm below. Behind them, the future waited, full of challenges and opportunities, full of the work that remained to be done. But for this moment, there was only the two of them, the warmth of connection after the cold of isolation, the promise of tomorrow after the near certainty of death. Dmitri Volkov had survived 24 hours at -88°C. He had faced the betrayal of his own blood and emerged stronger for it. He had chosen mercy over vengeance, love over hatred, the future over the past. And now, with Elena beside him, he was ready to face whatever came next. The weeks that followed were a time of rebuilding and consolidation. With Victor gone and the organization stabilized, Dimitri turned his attention to the legitimate businesses that represented his path forward. Real estate, technology, finance, the building blocks of an empire that could stand in the light rather than skulking in shadows. Elena returned to her work at the hospital, her skills as a doctor saving lives while Dimitri saved an organization. They fell into a rhythm, a partnership that balanced her compassion with his determination, her healing with his building. And slowly, carefully, the wounds of the past began to heal. There were still enemies to face, still challenges to overcome, still the endless dance of power and consequence that defined the world Dimitri had chosen. But he faced them differently now, with a clarity of purpose that had been sharpened by his brush with death in the frozen wastes of Yakutia. He had survived the unsurvivable. He had forgiven the unforgivable. He had chosen the path of transformation over the path of destruction, and in doing so, he had discovered that the greatest strength was not the power to destroy, but the courage to change. The story of Dmitry Volkov did not end in a frozen cabin in Siberia. It did not end with the betrayal of a brother or the mercy that followed. It continued, chapter after chapter, in the life he built with Elena, in the organization he transformed from shadow to light, in the person he became through struggle and choice and the refusal to surrender. 24 hours at -88 degrees Celsius. It should have been a death sentence. Instead, it became a beginning. If you have watched this far, it is because you liked this story. Leave a comment saying I have watched this far so I can get to know you and see who really enjoys the stories here on the channel. Your engagement means everything to this community, and I want to hear from you. And if this story moved you, if it made you feel something real, then please hit the like button and share it with someone who needs to hear that survival is possible, that transformation is real, that even the coldest darkness can give way to warmth and light. Subscribe to this channel for more stories like this one, stories of survival and redemption, of power and love, of the human spirit facing impossible odds and emerging stronger on the other side. Every week brings new journeys into the depths of the heart, new tales that will stay with you long after the video ends. This is not just entertainment. This is a community of souls who believe in the power of stories to change us, to heal us, to remind us who we really are. Welcome home.